Ireland, September 1845. A farmer in County Cork walks through his potato field at dawn. Yesterday, the leaves were green, the crop looked healthy, the harvest looked promising. Today, the leaves are black, the stems are rotting, and the air smells like death. He digs up a potato. It crumbles in his hands like ash. He digs up another. Same thing. Another. Another. Every single potato in his field is destroyed, and he knows, in that moment, that his family is going to starve. Because in Ireland in 1845, if you were poor, you ate potatoes. Nothing else. Just potatoes. 3 meals a day. 7 days a week. 12 pounds of potatoes per person per day. And now the potatoes were gone. But here's the thing that turned a crop failure into a catastrophe. The rent was still due. This is the story of the Great Hunger, the Irish Famine, and Gorda Moore. And it's not just a story about a plant disease. It's a story about a system that kept collecting rent while people starved to death. A system that treated food as a commodity and people as revenue streams. A system where the balance sheet mattered more than human life. To understand what happened, you need to understand what Ireland looked like in 1845. Ireland was part of the British Empire, had been for centuries. And the land? The land wasn't owned by the people who worked it. The land was owned by landlords. Many of them absentee landlords who lived in England and had never even seen their Irish estates. The Irish farmers were tenants. They rented tiny plots of land. They paid rent in cash. And on those tiny plots, they grew one thing: potatoes. Not because they loved potatoes, but because potatoes were the only crop that could feed a family on such a small piece of land. An acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a year. An acre of wheat, it would feed maybe 2 people. So the poorest Irish families, millions of them, depended entirely on the potato. One crop, one food source, 0 margin for error. The average Irish laborer had maybe a 1/4 acre plot, sometimes less. Just enough space to grow the potatoes that would keep his family alive. Nothing more. He didn't own the land. He couldn't pass it to his children as inheritance. He paid rent to a middleman, who paid rent to another middleman, who paid rent to a landlord who might never set foot in Ireland. It was a system built on extraction, layer after layer of people taking their cut, and at the bottom, the family eating 12 pounds of potatoes a day because that's all they could afford. And in September 1845, the potato crop didn't just fail, it was annihilated. The cause was a fungus, Phytophthora infestans, potato blight. It probably came from North America, carried on ships across the Atlantic. It spread across Europe in the summer of 1845. Belgium had crop failures. France had problems. But nowhere was as vulnerable as Ireland, because nowhere else had millions of people eating nothing but potatoes. The blight hit fast. A field could be healthy in the morning and black by evening. The potatoes rotted in the ground. The ones that were harvested rotted in storage. Families who stored potatoes in pits watched them turn to liquid slime within days. The smell was overwhelming. The smell of decay. The smell of catastrophe approaching. And within weeks, the food supply of millions of people was gone. People started dying in the winter of 1845. At first, people tried to survive on whatever they could find: nettles, seaweed, grass, berries, anything. They ate things that gave them dysentery, which made them weaker, which made them more vulnerable to disease. Children's bellies swelled from hunger edema, their hair fell out, their skin developed sores, and this was just year 1. But this was just the beginning, because in 1846, the blight came back. And in 1847, the worst year, the year they called Black 47, it came back again. 3 years, 3 failed harvests, 3 winters of hunger. And all the while, the rent was still due. Here's where the story becomes about money, about economics, about systems. The landlords needed the rent. Many of them were in debt themselves. They had mortgages. They had obligations. And under British law, they were now responsible for paying poor law taxes to support the destitute on their estates. The more destitute people on your land, the higher your tax bill. So landlords had a perverse incentive: get rid of the destitute people. So when tenants couldn't pay rent because they had no food to sell and no money to earn, landlords faced a choice: absorb the loss and risk bankruptcy, or evict the tenants. Most chose eviction. Between 1849 and 1854, nearly 500,000 people were evicted from their homes. Let that number sink in. 500,000 people. Families were thrown out of their cottages. The cottages were demolished, roofs torn off, walls knocked down so they couldn't return. Sometimes the evictions happened in winter. Families with young children thrown out into the snow with nowhere to go. In Kilrush, County Clare, Thousands were evicted in a single year. Entire townlands were cleared. The ruins of the cottages can still be seen today, silent monuments to families that once lived there. The process was brutal. Bailiffs and police would arrive. The family would be given minutes to gather their possessions. Then the crowbar brigade would move in, tearing down the roof, pushing in the walls. Some families watched their homes destroyed while holding starving children in their arms. Entire villages were cleared. The land was consolidated. The people were removed. And where did the evicted families go? Some went to workhouses, grim institutions where families were separated, men from women, parents from children, and conditions were brutal. The workhouse system was designed to be deterrent, to make poverty so unpleasant that people would do anything to avoid it. In the workhouses, you worked for your food, breaking stones, picking oakum, useless labor designed to humiliate. If you couldn't work, you got less food. If you were sick, you often died. Typhus and dysentery swept through the crowded, filthy buildings. Mothers were separated from their babies, husbands from wives. The idea was to prevent the workhouse from becoming comfortable, from encouraging dependency. Some people chose to die on the roadside rather than enter the workhouse, because at least on the roadside, they could die with their family. Some emigrated. They scraped together money for passage on ships to America or Canada. The ships were called coffin ships, because so many people died on board from typhus, dysentery, and starvation. People who were already starving and sick were packed into holds designed for cargo, not humans. No sanitation, no fresh air, no medical care. On some ships, 20% of passengers died during the voyage. On the worst ships, it was higher. Bodies were thrown overboard. Sometimes children died in their mothers' arms, and the mothers didn't have the strength to call out. Grosse Isle, the quarantine station in Canada, became a graveyard. Thousands of Irish immigrants died there and were buried in mass graves. Those who survived the voyage often arrived sick, penniless, and traumatized. They faced discrimination in their new countries, signs that said, "No Irish need apply," but at least they were alive. Some just wandered the roads, begging, until they collapsed and died. The roadsides were lined with bodies. Travelers reported seeing corpses in ditches, by hedgerows, in abandoned cabins. Mass graves were dug. Sometimes bodies weren't buried at all. There was no one strong enough to dig. In some villages, entire families died in their cabins. The neighbors were too weak to bury them, so the cabins became tombs. And the rent? The rent kept getting collected when it could be collected. When it couldn't, the land was cleared, the asset was preserved. Because to the system, the people weren't the asset. The land was the asset. How many people died? The best estimates say around 1 million people died from starvation and famine-related diseases between 1845 and 1852. Starvation, typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery. When your body has no food, your immune system collapses. Diseases that would normally be survivable become fatal. Children died first, then the elderly, then the adults. But the death toll doesn't tell the full story. Because Ireland's population didn't just fall by 1 million, it fell by more than 2 million. 1 million died, another million emigrated. They left on ships. They left on foot to port cities. They left because staying meant death. Ireland's population in 1841 was over 8 million. By 1851, it was 6 million, and it kept falling for decades. An entire generation was wiped out, not by war, not by plague in the traditional sense, by a system that kept functioning while people starved. Here's the part that makes this story even darker. While people were starving in Ireland, food was being exported from Ireland to Britain. Grain, cattle, pork, butter, ships left. Irish ports loaded with food, guarded by soldiers, while people starved on the docks. Armed guards, to protect food from starving people. In Cork, in Limerick, in Dublin, ships were loaded with grain, with livestock, with dairy products, and sailed to Britain while Irish people died of hunger within sight of those ports. Why? Because that food was owned by landlords and merchants who could sell it for profit in Britain. The Irish tenant farmers didn't own the grain they grew. They only owned barely the potatoes. And when the potatoes failed, they had no claim on the other food being produced on the land they worked. It was property. It was protected. It was exported. The market worked. Supply met demand. Prices were paid. And people starved within sight of food they couldn't afford and weren't allowed to touch. This is what makes the famine not just a tragedy, but a crime. Food existed. It was being produced on Irish soil, but it belonged to someone else, and that someone else chose profit over lives. So, what did the British government do? At first, the response was relatively swift. Prime Minister Robert Peel secretly purchased corn from America and set up relief depots. Peel understood the scale of the crisis. He tried to act, but his own party turned on him for interfering with the market. He lost power. But when Peel's government fell in 1846 and was replaced by Lord John Russell's administration, the policy changed. Russell and his ministers believed in laissez-faire economics. They believed the market would correct itself. They believed that too much government intervention would create dependency and distort the natural economy. This wasn't stupidity. This was ideology, a deeply held belief that market forces were natural, moral, and ultimately beneficial. So they shut down the relief depots. They insisted that relief should come through public works programs where the starving could earn money for food. The idea was, give people work, they earn money, they buy food. The market provides, everyone maintains their dignity, except the public works paid starvation wages. And by the time you were starving, you were often too weak to do manual labor. Men who were already weak from hunger were expected to break rocks and build roads for hours a day, in winter, in the rain, for wages that weren't enough to feed their families. Many collapsed on the job and died. Others took their meager wages and bought food, but it was too little, too late. They set up soup kitchens in 1847, which helped. 3 million people were being fed by soup kitchens at the peak. This actually worked. When food was distributed directly, people didn't die. Radical concept. But then they shut those down too, insisting that relief should come through the poor law workhouses, which meant if you wanted food, you had to enter the workhouse. Give up your freedom, split up your family, accept the stigma. Charles Trevelyan, the British official overseeing famine relief, believed the famine was a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence that would teach the Irish a lesson. He believed the Irish were lazy and dependent, and that the famine was, in some twisted way, good for them. He wrote that, in official documents, while 1 million people died, Trevelyan saw the famine as an opportunity to restructure Irish agriculture, to consolidate holdings, to make Ireland more efficient. The deaths were regrettable, but ultimately necessary for progress. This is how ideology kills, not through malice, but through the belief that abstract principles matter more than human lives. Here's what's important to understand. The system wasn't irrational from its own perspective. The landlords weren't cartoon villains twirling mustaches. Many of them were facing financial ruin themselves. Their rents had collapsed. Their estates were being seized by creditors. Some landlords did try to help. They reduced rents. They distributed food. They went bankrupt trying to save their tenants. Others calculated that their best financial move was to clear the land and start over, not out of cruelty, but out of economic logic. The British government officials weren't all cruel monsters. Many of them genuinely believed that market forces and limited government intervention were the right approach. They believed that creating dependency would be worse in the long run than allowing short-term suffering. They had seen how welfare systems could create poverty traps. They wanted to avoid that. Their intentions in their own minds were good. From inside the system, the decisions made sense. Protect property rights. Don't distort the market. Encourage self-reliance. Avoid moral hazard. But the result, the actual, observable, undeniable result, was mass death. 1 million people dead. Another million forced to flee. Entire communities erased. Because the system valued property over people, markets over lives, abstract principles over concrete suffering. The rent was more important than the renter. The land was more important than the people on the land. And when you build a system with those values, this is what happens. The Great Hunger didn't just kill people in the 1840s. It reshaped Ireland for generations. The population never recovered. Ireland today has roughly the same population it had in the 1840s, despite nearly 2 centuries of growth elsewhere. Think about that. Almost every other country in the world has seen massive population growth since the mid-1800s. Ireland has not. The demographic wound never healed. The Irish diaspora spread across the world, America, Britain, Australia. Millions of descendants of famine emigrants, carrying the memory of what happened. Today, more people of Irish descent live outside Ireland than in it. The famine didn't just kill a generation, it scattered an entire people. The political relationship between Ireland and Britain was poisoned. The seeds of Irish independence were planted in the mass graves of the famine. Because when 1 million people die while food is being exported, while rent is being collected, while officials call it providence, that's not a natural disaster. That's a choice. That's a system. That's policy. And people remember. The memory of the famine became part of Irish identity, a wound that never quite closed. So what's the lesson? First, monoculture is catastrophically dangerous. When millions of people depend on one crop, one food source, one income stream, you're one blight away from disaster. The Irish didn't choose monoculture. The economic system forced them into it. Tiny plots plus high rent equals potatoes, no alternative. But the vulnerability was created by that system. Today, we still have monocultures. Entire regions dependent on one crop. Entire countries dependent on one export. Entire economies dependent on one industry. And we act surprised when shocks happen. Second, markets don't care about people. Food was available during the famine. It just wasn't affordable. It just wasn't distributed to those who needed it. The market worked. Prices responded to supply and demand. Property rights were protected. And 1 million people died. Markets are tools. They're good at allocating resources efficiently. But efficient doesn't mean just. It doesn't mean humane. When we treat markets as moral systems instead of mechanical systems, people die. Third, systems designed to extract will keep extracting, even during a crisis. The rent didn't stop. The evictions didn't stop. The exports didn't stop. Because the system wasn't designed to protect people. It was designed to generate revenue. And when crisis hit, it kept doing what it was designed to do. This is the core insight. Systems don't have empathy. They have functions. And they will keep performing those functions until someone deliberately changes them. Look around today. How many people are one paycheck away from disaster? One medical bill? One crop failure? One price spike? How many systems are designed to keep extracting rent, debt payments, fees, profits, regardless of whether people can actually afford it? When eviction moratoriums end, what happens? The system resumes. The rent comes due. When student loan payments resume after a pause, what happens? The system resumes. The payments come due. When food prices spike due to drought or war or supply chains, what happens? The market adjusts. People who can't afford food go hungry. The mechanisms are more sophisticated now. The language is more polite. But the underlying logic that markets and property rights and financial obligations must be protected, even at the cost of human suffering, that logic hasn't changed. The Great Hunger happened because a system valued land over lives, rent over people, economic theory over human reality, and variations of that system are still running today. In Ireland, they built memorials to the famine, statues of skeletal figures, museums documenting the horror. They say, never forget, never again. But the never again only works if you understand what actually caused it. It wasn't just a fungus. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a system that kept collecting rent while people starved. A system that treated humans as line items on a balance sheet. And if you don't challenge that system, if you don't build alternatives that prioritize human dignity over financial extraction, then it can happen again. Different context, different crops, different countries, but the same logic, the same result. The rent will come due, the system will keep functioning, and people will suffer. Unless we choose to build something different. The Great Hunger killed 1 million people. Make sure you understand why. Because the next famine, economic, ecological, or both, might be closer than you think.